For centuries, European maps contained this really specific warning about the African coastline.
Right, right.
If a ship sailed past a point called Cape Bujador, which is, on the coast of the Western Sahara, the maps literally indicated that the ocean would begin to boil.
Yeah, boil. Like a pot on a stove.
And the sun was thought to be so close to the earth right there that it would just scorch the crew alive.
It's intense, and the waters were allegedly teeming with these massive sea monsters that could just, crush a wooden hull into splinters.
Right. And to the sailors of the early 15th century, this wasn't a metaphor. It was accepted geographic fact.
Totally. They called it the Dark Sea.
The Dark Sea. So today we are looking at the people who looked at those exact maps, built an entirely new kind of ship, and deliberately sailed straight into that boiling water. Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
We're mapping out the precise mechanisms by which a kingdom of roughly 1 million people, isolated on this far western edge of the Iberian Peninsula, transitioned from sailing strictly within sight of land to engineering the first truly global intercontinental maritime empire.
Yeah, and before we dig into the material for this deep dive, just a quick note for you on the history we are covering today.
Right, it's heavy stuff.
It is. The historical records from this era, they document these massive engineering feats, but they also document military conquests, religious crusades, and, the brutal initiation of the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, the sources are very clear on that.
So we are looking at the raw, unvarnished history today strictly as the records show it.
Yeah.
We're not taking sides or endorsing the actions of the past, but impartially breaking down the factual events and examining exactly how they fundamentally rewired the economic and geographic realities of the world.
And to really grasp the scale of what happened, we have to look at this not as a collection of random sea voyages. It was this highly systematic, state-sponsored engineering project.
Like a massive puzzle.
Exactly. It was a generational puzzle. Every time the Portuguese solved one geographical or technological problem, that solution immediately unlocked a completely new, far more complex problem.
So to understand that first puzzle piece, we have to figure out why Portugal decided to look out into the open ocean in the first place. I mean, they were a relatively poor kingdom.
Very poor, relatively speaking.
And essentially landlocked by their massive, powerful neighbor, Castile, which, would later become Spain. What was the catalyst that pushed them off the land and onto the water?
Well, the timeline in the sources points directly to the year 1415. That is the year everything shifts.
What happens in 1415?
King John I of Portugal launched a massive military expedition across the Strait of Gibraltar into North Africa, and they successfully conquered the Muslim port city of Ceuta.
Now, this wasn't just a random coastal raid, right?
Not at all. No, Ceuta was one of the wealthiest cities in the entire region. It was a highly fortified, strategic choke point. And more importantly, it was a northern terminus for the trans-Saharan trade caravans.
Ah, so the money was flowing right through there.
Exactly. By capturing Ceuta, the Portuguese suddenly found themselves inside the treasury. They were exposed firsthand to this immense wealth flowing out of the African interior.
We're talking gold, right?
Gold, ivory, and spices. Wealth that had previously been, completely monopolized by Islamic merchants.
But capturing a city is one thing. Holding it requires a justification back home. Like, how did they frame this massive undertaking to the public and the nobility?
They framed it as a continuation of the Reconquista.
The centuries-long conflict.
Right. For centuries, the Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula had been fighting to reclaim territory from the Muslim Moors. And by the 13th century, Portugal had actually entirely expelled the Moors from their own borders.
But they had to take the fight somewhere else.
Yeah, taking Ceuta was framed as taking the Holy War across the water. It was a geopolitical maneuver wrapped in deep religious fervor.
I want to break down those underlying motivations for you listening, because the material outlines this highly integrated, three-pronged strategy driving the expansion.
Yeah, it was economic, geopolitical, and religious, all just deeply woven together.
Let's start with the economics. Why were spices so critical that an entire nation would completely re-engineer its economy to find them?
It is genuinely difficult for a modern mind to understand the sheer value of spices in the 15th century. We are talking primarily about black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg.
Just basic stuff in our kitchens today.
Right, but back then, these were not just culinary luxuries. I mean, in an era before refrigeration, spices were heavily used to mask the taste of preserved, heavily salted, or even, slightly spoiled meat,
Oh, that makes sense.
and they were used in medicine. But above all, they were the ultimate status symbol. If you were a European noble, serving heavily spiced food was how you demonstrated your immense wealth and power.
But Europe doesn't grow pepper or cloves.
Exactly. Every single peppercorn had to be imported from Asia. And the problem for Western Europe was the supply chain.
Too many middlemen.
Way too many. Spices originated in places like India and the Indonesian archipelago. Then they were transported by Arab and Indian merchants across the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf.
Long journey.
And from there, they were carried overland by caravan to the Eastern Mediterranean.
And sitting right there at the end of the pipeline, acting as this ultimate toll booth, is the Republic of Venice.
Venice had negotiated these exclusive trade agreements with the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt. So by the time a sack of pepper reached Lisbon, it had been marked up by half a dozen different intermediaries.
And Venice was taking the final massive cut.
Right. And Portugal simply did not have the bullion, the gold and silver, to sustain that kind of trade deficit. They recognized that if they could somehow find a direct sea route to the source of the spices, they could cut out Venice.
Cut out the Islamic intermediaries completely.
Yeah, and capture that entire profit margin for themselves.
Which leads directly into the geopolitical strategy. If they capture that wealth, what does it actually buy them?
It buys them independence and state power.
Because of Castile.
Exactly. Portugal was constantly under threat of just being absorbed by Castile. To maintain their sovereignty, the Portuguese crown needed an independent, overwhelming source of revenue to fund their military and fortify those borders.
So the ocean offered a way to outflank their continental rivals.
That's it exactly.
Okay, so that covers the economic and the geopolitical. The third prong is the religious drive. And looking at the sources, this is where the history sounds almost like a fantasy novel. They were actively searching for a man named Prester John.
Prester John.
Let's unpack this for you. Who was Prester John supposed to be?
Well, Prester John was a deeply entrenched medieval European myth. He was believed to be this phenomenally wealthy, immensely powerful Christian monarch who ruled a vast kingdom somewhere out in the east.
Like in India.
Either in India or deep within Africa. The geography was always a bit vague.
So a completely fictional person.
Wholly fictional, but treated by European monarchs as an absolute geopolitical reality.
That is wild.
The Portuguese objective was to locate the kingdom of Prester John, establish diplomatic contact, and forge a massive military alliance.
Like a global pincer movement.
Precisely. The strategic concept was that if Portugal attacked the Islamic powers from the west, and Prester John attacked from the south or east, they could permanently break the power of their religious rivals.
So we have this massive unified motivation, right? Bypass the Venetian spice monopoly, secure unimaginable wealth to hold off Castile, and find a mythical Christian king to win a holy war.
It's a lot of ambition.
But recognizing the goal is easy. Funding the attempt to achieve it, that is the real barrier here. This required intense, sustained state sponsorship.
Right, because it required capital that the Portuguese crown alone simply did not possess. And this is where an organization called the Order of Christ becomes central to the story.
The Order of Christ. Now, the sources say they were the direct Portuguese successor to the Knights Templar, correct?
That is exactly what they were. When the Knights Templar were persecuted and officially disbanded by the Pope in the early 14th century, the Portuguese king, Denis, essentially rebranded them within his borders.
Just a name change, basically.
Pretty much. He transferred all the Templar properties, their castles, and these immense financial assets into this newly created Order of Christ. So you have this deeply religious military order sitting on a vast reserve of capital.
And then in 1420, a specific royal figure steps in to direct those funds.
Prince Henry.
Prince Henry, often referred to in later centuries as Henry the Navigator.
Right.
He was the third son of King John I. And because he was the third son, he was unlikely to ever inherit the throne, which really freed him up to pursue other ambitions.
He had fought at Ceuta, right?
Yes, he had seen the gold and heard the rumors of the African interior firsthand. So in 1420, he was appointed as the governor of the Order of Christ.
That is a highly strategic appointment. Oh, it gave him unilateral control over the order's wealth. Henry began funneling those massive financial resources directly into outfitting ships and sponsoring voyages down the western coast of Africa.
Okay, I want to stop and address a very persistent historical narrative surrounding Prince Henry that the sources talk about.
Yeah.
There is this idea that he retreated to a place called Sagres on the southwestern tip of Portugal and founded a formal school of navigation.
Yeah, that's a very popular myth.
The way it's often taught, it sounds like he built a modern university with classrooms full of map makers and sailors taking notes.
The historical records completely dismantle that myth. There was no formal school of Sagres in the academic sense. There was no curriculum, no faculty, and no university building.
Interesting. So what actually happened?
What happened was much more organic and empirical. Henry created a practical, operational hub. By sponsoring these voyages, he naturally attracted the top talent from across the Mediterranean.
I guess that's where the money was.
Exactly. Jewish cartographers from Majorca, Italian shipbuilders, astronomers, and veteran pilots, they all congregated where the funding was. It functioned a lot more like a modern tech incubator or, an aerospace command center.
So not a classroom, but a workshop.
Right. Returning captains would come ashore, debrief Henry's team, hand over their raw data regarding winds, currents, and coastline shapes, and the cartographers would immediately update the master maps.
They were just iteratively improving their methods based entirely on real-world observation and, well, failure.
A lot of failure, yes.
So they have the motivation, they have the venture capital from the Order of Christ, and they have the brain trust assembled. But when they try to actually sail south down the African coast, they hit a hard physical limit.
The technology they possessed was fundamentally incapable of doing the job.
Let's talk about the ships. The standard ships of the Mediterranean were designed for a very specific environment, right?
Yes. The Mediterranean is an enclosed sea. The waters are relatively calm, and the winds are highly variable. So the dominant vessel was the galley.
The rowboats.
Massive rowboats, yeah. Galleys relied heavily on large banks of oars rowed by human beings, supplemented by simple square sails.
So why does a galley fail in the open Atlantic?
Think about the physics and the logistics. You have a heavy, long, narrow wooden hull. To move it, you need hundreds of rowers.
Right.
And hundreds of rowers require massive daily caloric intake and huge quantities of fresh drinking water. A galley cannot carry enough food and water to sustain its crew for more than a few days at a time.
Because all the cargo space is taken up by the crew itself.
Exactly. They were built for coastal hopping, sailing during the day, beaching at night, and constantly resupplying. The moment you take a galley into the massive swells and unpredictable weather of the open Atlantic Ocean, it just becomes a death trap.
Even the merchant sailing ships they had, the barcas, were highly limited.
Yeah, the barcas use square rigging. Now, a square sail acts like a parachute. It is incredibly efficient if the wind is blowing exactly in the direction you want to go. The wind hits the sail and pushes the ship forward from behind.
Right. Simple enough.
But what happens when you want to sail south, down the African coast? The prevailing winds off North Africa blow steadily from north to south.
So sailing down is easy. The parachute fills and you glide south.
Right. But how do you get home? If the wind is blowing from the north and you only have a square sail, you cannot sail north. You are trapped.
This was the technological crisis. They needed a ship that could somehow sail against the wind.
And this crisis forces the first major technological leap of the era, the caravel.
The caravel. The records treat the invention of the caravel almost like the invention of the microchip, like it changed everything overnight. How did they redesign the ship to solve this wind problem?
The caravel was a masterclass in hybrid engineering. The Portuguese shipbuilders took the basic sturdy hull of a northern European fishing vessel, which, could handle heavy Atlantic waves.
Okay, tough hull.
And they combined it with a specific sail technology they adapted from Islamic mariners, the lateen sail.
The triangular sail.
Yes, a large triangular sail mounted at an angle on the mast. The lateen sail does not function like a parachute. It functions exactly like an airplane wing.
Oh, that's a great way to picture it.
When the wind hits the curved surface of the lateen sail, it forces the air to travel faster over the front side than the back side.
Creating a pressure differential.
Exactly. It creates lower pressure on one side and higher pressure on the other. This generates lift. So instead of being pushed from behind, the ship is literally pulled forward by the low pressure.
That is brilliant.
This aerodynamic lift allows the caravel to sail at an angle very close to the direction the wind is blowing from.
So just to be clear, if the wind is blowing straight down from the north, the caravel cannot sail directly straight north, right?
Correct. But it can sail northeast and then pivot and sail northwest.
That maneuver is called tacking or zigzagging.
Yes. By tacking back and forth across the wind, a caravel could make steady, reliable progress against the prevailing coastal winds. They had solved the return problem.
And the crew size was much smaller too, right?
Much smaller. They had built a vessel that was fast, highly maneuverable, and required a crew of maybe 20 men.
Meaning it could stay at sea for weeks at a time without needing to resupply.
Exactly.
So they've essentially built the 15th century equivalent of a spaceship with the caravel. It can go anywhere. But a spaceship is useless if you are flying blind.
Right.
Once you are hundreds of miles out in the open ocean, the old methods of figuring out where you are completely fall apart.
Right. Before this era, navigation was based on a system called dead reckoning.
Dead reckoning. Let's explain that.
Dead reckoning is a deductive process.
Yeah.
You start at a known point, say the port of Lisbon. You use a magnetic compass to establish your heading.
Okay.
Then you estimate the speed of your ship, usually by throwing a piece of wood off the bow and timing how long it takes to pass the stern. Then you multiply your estimated speed by the time elapsed, which was measured by a sand glass.
So speed times time equals distance. It sounds perfectly logical.
It is logical, and it works perfectly well for short distances like crossing the English Channel. But over long oceanic distances, the mathematics break down rapidly.
Because of variables you can't see.
Precisely. Ocean currents are moving the ship while you sail. Leeway, which is the wind pushing the hull sideways, alters your true heading. And the compass itself has slight magnetic variations.
So in dead reckoning, every small error compounds the next error.
Yes, if your speed estimate is off by just half a knot after 2 weeks at sea, your calculated position on the map might be hundreds of miles away from your actual physical location in the ocean.
Which means if a massive storm blows you completely off course for 3 days, you are totally lost. Your internal map is just broken.
You need an external reference point that the storm cannot move.
Which forced the Portuguese to look up at the sky.
Exactly. They recognize that the stars and the sun operate on fixed, predictable mathematical paths. If they could measure their relationship to those celestial bodies, they could calculate their position on the Earth.
They needed to move from dead reckoning to astronavigation.
Right.
So they started looking at tools used by land-based astronomers and cosmographers, specifically the astrolabe. Now wait, I am stuck on this concept in the sources.
What's the sticking point?
You are telling me that illiterate 15th century sailors are doing spherical trigonometry on a wet, pitching wooden deck in the middle of a storm. That makes no sense to me.
It shouldn't make sense.
Right. The math simply does not add up. A university astronomer needs a stable stone floor and hours of calculation to use an astrolabe properly. How does a sailor do it?
Your skepticism is entirely warranted, and the Portuguese cosmographers recognize that exact same problem. An academic astrolabe is a highly complex, delicate instrument. It's covered in intricate planetary grids.
Useless on a rocking ship.
Useless. So the scholars back in Lisbon explicitly re-engineered the tool. They stripped it down to its absolute barest function.
What does a mariner's astrolabe actually look like then?
It looks like a heavy, thick ring of solid brass or bronze. The weight is crucial. It acts as a plumb bob, so the instrument hangs perfectly vertical regardless of the ship's motion.
Oh, so it fights the sway of the boat.
Yes. And they also cut large holes out of the solid sections of the disc so the ocean wind would pass right through it.
Ah, preventing it from swinging wildly in a gale.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's stable. But how do they extract data from it?
The only markings left on a mariner's astrolabe are a simple scale of degrees around the outer edge from 0 to 90. And in the center is a rotating sighting rule called an alidade.
Okay.
To find their latitude, which is their distance north or south of the equator, the pilot would hold the astrolabe by a ring at the top. At exactly solar noon, when the sun reached its highest point in the sky, they would rotate the alidade.
They're not staring directly into the sun.
No, that would blind them. The alidade has 2 small plates with pinholes. The pilot adjusts the roll until a single beam of sunlight passes through the top pinhole and perfectly hits the bottom pinhole.
So they're just lining up the light.
When those line up, they look at where the rule points on the degree scale. That number is the altitude of the sun above the horizon.
But the altitude of the sun changes every single day of the year depending on the seasons.
Correct.
A 30-degree reading in December means something completely different than a 30-degree reading in June. So we are right back to the complex math problem. How does the pilot translate that raw angle into actual latitude without a degree in astronomy?
This is where the true genius of the system lies. They outsource the math.
What do you mean?
The cosmographers in Portugal did all the spherical trigonometry ahead of time. They compiled massive books of tables, the most famous being the Regimento do Astrolabio e Quadrante.
So it's basically a cheat sheet.
Exactly, a highly sophisticated cheat sheet. The cosmographers calculated the exact declination of the sun for every single day of a 4-year leap cycle. They printed these manuals and put them on the ships.
That is incredibly practical.
The pilot did not need to understand the underlying theory of the cosmos. The process was reduced to a simple algorithm. Take the astrolabe reading at noon. Open the manual to today's date. Look at the number in the column. Then follow a basic rule, either add or subtract the table number from your astrolabe number. The final result was your exact latitude.
So they turned high-level theoretical astronomy into a blue-collar technical procedure.
Precisely. They industrialized navigation.
Wow. By knowing their exact latitude, a ship could sail deep into the unknown ocean, get completely blown off course by a storm, wait for a clear noon sky, take a reading, and know exactly how far north or south they were.
And this capability to confidently leave the coastline and survive out in the deep water leads directly to perhaps their most significant navigational discovery, the Volta do Mar, or the turn of the sea.
Right. Let's talk about the wind, because the wind's not chaotic, is it?
No, the Earth's atmosphere operates as a massive, highly structured engine. Driven by the rotation of the Earth and solar heating, the winds over the oceans form massive circular conveyor belts called gyres.
Earlier, we discussed how the coastal winds off North Africa blow continuously southward.
Right. And while the caravel could tack against that wind to get back home, tacking is incredibly slow and highly labor-intensive. It requires the crew to constantly adjust the heavy sails.
So if fighting the wind straight up the coast is too slow, what is the alternative?
The alternative requires a massive leap of faith. The Portuguese pilots started experimenting. They realized that if, on their return journey, they deliberately turned their ships west, pouring the bow away from the safety of the land, and sailing out into the deep, terrifying void of the open Atlantic, they would eventually hit a different layer of the atmospheric engine.
It's almost like orbital mechanics in spaceflight. You don't just point your rocket straight at your destination and fire the engines. You have to understand the invisible forces at play, like slingshotting around a planet's gravity.
That is a perfect analogy. The Portuguese learned to use the ocean's invisible atmospheric gravity. By sailing hundreds of miles northwest into the open ocean, they would eventually intersect with the prevailing westerly winds near the latitude of the Azores Islands.
And those winds are moving east.
Yes. These westerlies would catch their sails and blow them smoothly and rapidly eastward, straight back into the port of Lisbon.
So they literally sailed away from home to get home faster.
Yes. They discovered that the fastest path between 2 points on the ocean is almost never a straight line. It is a massive curve that rides the wind patterns. The Volta do Mar was the key that unlocked the entire Atlantic Ocean.
And as they gathered all this data for the wind patterns, the latitudes of specific capes, the safe harbors, they codified it. They didn't just keep it in their heads.
Right, they compiled it into rotiros.
Rotiros.
These were highly classified, state-owned sailing directories. A rotiro contains step-by-step instructions like sail south to this specific latitude, turn east, avoid the shoals at this depth.
They transformed terrifying, isolated leaps into the unknown into standard, repeatable commercial routes.
Exactly.
But the records mention that once these routes were standardized, the trusty caravel actually started to be phased out. Why replace the ship that made it all possible?
Because the mission parameters changed. The caravel was designed for exploration. It was small, nimble, and could sail close to shore to map the coast. But once you know exactly how to get to the destination and how to get back, the goal shifts from exploration to bulk cargo transport. You need to maximize the payload.
So they needed a bigger truck?
Basically, yeah. They developed the Nau, or the Carrack.
The Carrack.
The Nau was a massive, high-sided cargo fortress. It was much heavier than the caravel. To move that much mass, they used a combination rig. They kept the lateen sail on the rear masts for maneuverability, but they put massive square sails on the main mast to capture the raw power of the trade winds.
They traded the caravel's agility for sheer endurance and the capacity to haul hundreds of tons of spices and gold.
Exactly.
Okay, so armed with this suite of technology, the lateen sail, the mariner's astrolabe, the rotiros, and an understanding of the Volta do Mar, the Portuguese were finally equipped to bypass the perilous currents of the African coast.
Right.
The barrier of the Dark Sea could be breached.
And in 1434, an explorer named Gil Eanes, who was directly sponsored by Prince Henry, achieved the breakthrough.
What did he do?
He sailed out into the deep ocean, bypassed the boiling water myth entirely, and successfully rounded Cape Bojador. He proved that the ocean beyond was completely navigable and, the land was not on fire.
It was a massive psychological victory.
Huge. Once that mental block was removed, the descent down the West African coast accelerated rapidly.
But they weren't just mapping. They were building an infrastructure of extraction. The records detail the systematic establishment of what they called fetorias. Let's detail how these functioned.
A feitoria was a highly fortified coastal trading post. The Portuguese understood their demographic limitations. They did not have the manpower to invade the African continent, conquer inland kingdoms, and hold vast territories.
Right, there was only about 1 million Portuguese back home.
Exactly. So they negotiated with local rulers to build a fortress directly on the beach at strategic geographic choke points.
They essentially built secure warehouses heavily armed with naval artillery.
Yes. The most famous and lucrative of these was San Jorge da Mina, commonly known as Elmina, constructed in 1482 in present-day Ghana. They actually shipped pre-cut stone from Portugal all the way down there to assemble this massive castle on the coast.
The name Elmina roughly translates to the mine, right?
Right, because the primary resource they were tapping into was West African gold.
The gold from the caravans.
By establishing Elmina, the Portuguese achieved one of their primary economic objectives. They tapped directly into the source of the gold that the trans-Saharan caravans had been bringing up to Ceuta.
So they cut out the overland middleman again.
Exactly. Local African merchants brought gold dust and nuggets from the interior directly to the gates of Elmina to trade for European manufactured goods like brass, copper, textiles.
How much gold are we talking about here?
At its peak, Elmina was channeling hundreds of kilograms of gold into Lisbon annually. This massive influx of bullion finally provided the Portuguese crown with the independent wealth it needed to fund further, far more expensive expeditions toward India.
But gold was not the only commodity. This is the period that marks the terrifying initiation of the transatlantic slave trade. The records lay out the exact mechanics of how this horrific system evolved, and it's important we look at it clearly.
It is a profoundly grim evolution. In the early 1440s, the initial Portuguese expeditions engaged in direct, violent raids. Armed crews would land on the coast, attack coastal villages, kidnap men, women, and children, and drag them back to the ships to be sold in Portugal.
But the records show that this strategy shifted very quickly, didn't it?
Yes. Direct raiding was dangerous and highly inefficient for the Portuguese. The local African populations quickly realized the threat, fortified their defenses, and heavily ambushed the raiding parties. They inflicted severe casualties on the Portuguese crews.
So the Portuguese quickly pivoted to a purely commercial strategy.
Right. They integrated themselves into pre-existing, localized African systems of servitude and warfare.
They turned it into a corporate supply chain.
Exactly. They began purchasing enslaved human beings directly from coastal African kings and intermediaries at the fetorias. They traded brass bracelets, textiles, and eventually firearms in exchange for captives taken in inland wars.
The economic loop described in the historical material is highly efficient and entirely brutal. Where were these enslaved people being sent initially? Not to the Americas yet, right?
Right. Initially, they were brought back to Portugal to serve as domestic labor, but soon the Portuguese crown colonized uninhabited volcanic islands in the Atlantic, such as Madeira and later São Tomé in the Gulf of Guinea.
And what was on those islands?
The soil and climate on these islands were perfect for growing sugarcane.
I mean, sugar cultivation is incredibly labor-intensive.
It is brutal, back-breaking, dangerous work. Free European labor would not do it, or they demanded wages that made the sugar unprofitable.
So the Portuguese utilized the enslaved African labor they were purchasing to work the sugar mills.
Exactly. The gold funded the expansion, the enslaved labor worked the new territories, and the sugar generated massive profits back in Europe. This system, capital from Europe, enslaved labor from Africa, and cash crop production on colonized islands became the exact, devastating blueprint for the transatlantic plantation economies that would soon blanket Brazil and the Caribbean.
I want to look at the impact of all this wealth on Portugal itself. They hit the jackpot. Gold is flowing in, sugar profits are soaring. But the records indicate that this sudden, massive influx of wealth actually caused severe structural damage to the country's domestic landscape.
Yeah, it's an economic phenomenon often called the resource curse.
How does getting rich hurt the nation?
Because the wealth generated by gold and sugar was intensely centralized. It flowed directly into the royal treasury and into the hands of a few elite merchant families in the capital city of Lisbon.
So it didn't trickle down.
Not at all. In fact,
Really?
it acted as a massive demographic vacuum. If you were an ambitious young person working on a farm in the Portuguese countryside, why would you stay there? The money, the prestige, and the opportunity were all on the ships and in the capital. The rural population abandoned the agricultural interior and flocked to the coast to join the maritime empire.
Which means no one is left to grow the food.
Exactly. Domestic agriculture suffered a total collapse. Portugal, a country that possessed fertile land and had previously exported agricultural goods, completely lost its ability to self-sustain.
That's incredible.
The focus on the maritime extraction economy was so absolute that the nation was forced to use its gold to import basic food staples, like wheat, from northern European regions like Flanders, just to feed its own population.
The empire was gutting the nation from the inside.
Precisely.
Well, despite the domestic issues, the pace of exploration down the African coast accelerated significantly under King Afonso V in the late 15th century. And he tries this fascinating administrative experiment. Rather than funding everything through the royal treasury, he decides to privatize the exploration.
Right. In 1469, King Afonso V leased the monopoly rights of the entire Guinea trade to a wealthy Lisbon merchant named Fernand Gomes.
But the lease came with a very specific, aggressive performance metric.
The primary condition of the contract was that Gomes had to physically explore and chart 100 leagues, roughly 300 miles of new, unknown African coastline every single year for 5 years.
It is the exact equivalent of a modern government outsourcing critical infrastructure development to a private contractor. The Crown offloads the financial risk, but guarantees rapid, continuous progress.
And the privatization worked perfectly. Driven by the profit motive, Gomes's explorers pushed relentlessly south. They finally crossed the equator, where they had to figure out how to navigate without the North Star, and they discovered the islands in the Gulf of Guinea. They methodically mapped the enormous southern curve of the African continent.
Decades of this methodical mapping, studying the winds, calculating the latitudes, fighting the currents, it all culminated in a rapid sequence of 3 monumental voyages. These 3 expeditions definitively connected the hemispheres, shattered the old geographic models, and changed the map of the world forever.
The first major breakthrough occurs in 1488. An explorer named Bartolomeu Dias pushes further south than any European before him. He gets caught in a massive storm that blows him out into the deep ocean for days.
Must have been terrifying.
Absolutely. When the weather clears and he finally manages to sail back eastward, expecting to hit the African coast, he hits nothing. He realizes he has sailed completely past the southern tip of the continent.
He rounded what becomes known as the Cape of Good Hope.
Yes.
Why is this specific piece of geography so critical?
Because it overturned centuries of accepted geographic doctrine. Since the time of the ancient Greek geographer Ptolemy, the academic consensus in Europe was that the Indian Ocean was a massive landlocked lake. They believed the African landmass connected seamlessly to a vast southern continent, the Terra Australis.
Meaning there was no physical way to sail there.
Exactly. Dias proved Ptolemy wrong. He proved that the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean were connected by open water. He proved that an all-water sea route from Europe to the spice markets of Asia was physically possible.
Which sets the stage for the realization of the century-long dream, Vasco da Gama's voyage to India from 1497 to 1499.
Right. Da Gama's expedition was the culmination of everything Henry the Navigator and King John II had worked toward. He utilized the Volta do Mar to swing deep into the South Atlantic, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, sailed up the eastern coast of Africa, and successfully crossed the Indian Ocean to drop anchor at Calicut, India in May of 1498.
But the way the records describe da Gama's voyage, it shatters the romanticized image of peaceful explorers making first contact. This wasn't a diplomatic trade mission, was it?
It was a highly militarized incursion into a deeply established economic zone. When da Gama's fleet reached the eastern coast of Africa, they didn't find empty shores. They entered a sophisticated, thriving network of Swahili city-states and Arab merchant syndicates that had been trading across the Indian Ocean for centuries.
And these merchants were rightfully suspicious of this strange, heavily armed European fleet suddenly appearing in their waters.
Oh, the reception was hostile, largely because the trade goods da Gama brought from Portugal, woolen coats, brass wash basins, were completely worthless to wealthy Indian Ocean merchants who dealt in fine silk, porcelain, and gold.
Right.
At the port of Mozambique, the local sultan was insulted by the poor quality of the Portuguese gifts. Tensions escalated, and when da Gama was forced to flee the harbor, he ordered his ships to turn their naval artillery on the city and bombard the port.
So they're literally shooting their way up the coast.
Yeah.
How did they actually manage to cross the massive expanse of the Indian Ocean, though? They didn't have roteros for that.
They couldn't have crossed it alone. The Indian Ocean is governed by the monsoon winds, which completely reverse direction based on the season. If you sail at the wrong time, you die.
Right.
Further north, at the port of Malindi, da Gama managed to secure the services of an expert local pilot, likely a Gujarati or Arab navigator, who possessed an intimate understanding of the monsoons. This pilot guided the Portuguese fleet safely across the open ocean to India.
I want to focus on the human cost of this voyage because looking at the numbers, the mortality rate is staggering.
It is catastrophic. Da Gama's fleet spent unprecedented, continuous months out on the open water, far out of sight of land. They exhausted their supplies of fresh food, and this led to a devastating outbreak of scurvy.
Let's be explicit about what scurvy actually is. It's not just feeling tired.
No, scurvy is a severe deficiency of vitamin C. Because the human body cannot produce vitamin C and it is required to synthesize collagen, the structural connective tissue of the body essentially begins to break down.
That sounds horrific.
The gums swell and rot, teeth fall out, joints ache agonizingly, and terrifyingly old, fully healed wounds literally reopen because the scar tissue dissolves.
They're slowly dissolving from the inside out while trying to sail a massive wooden ship through a storm.
Da Gama departed Lisbon with 4 ships and roughly 170 men. When the battered expedition finally limped back into the Tagus River in Lisbon 2 years later, only 2 ships remained, and only about 60 men had survived.
So they essentially signed a death warrant for over half their workforce to complete the mission. To lose over half your crew is a disaster by any human metric. But from an economic perspective,
From an economic perspective, it was an unparalleled triumph. The modest cargo of pepper and cinnamon that da Gama managed to bring back, even after all the losses, yielded a profit margin that was 60 times the total cost of outfitting the entire expedition.
60 times.
The financial viability of the direct sea route to Asia was proven beyond any mathematical doubt. The Venetian monopoly was broken.
And right on the heels of da Gama's return, the Crown immediately scrambles the next fleet. This is the third major breakthrough, Pedro Alvarez Cabral in 1500.
Cabral was given command of a massive, heavily armed armada of 13 ships. His orders were to retrace da Gama's route to India, establish a permanent Victoria at Calicut, and project overwhelming military power.
But things didn't go exactly to plan.
While executing the maneuver through the Atlantic to reach the southern tip of Africa, Cabral made landfall on an entirely unknown coastline. He officially claimed the landmass of South America, specifically Brazil, for the Portuguese crown.
There was a vivid interaction documented during Cabral's landing that really highlights the vast cultural divide of this era. The fleet had a scribe on board, Pero Vaz de Caminha, who wrote a highly detailed letter back to the king describing the events.
Yes, Caminha documented the first encounters with the indigenous Tupiniquim people on the Brazilian beach. The Portuguese, driven entirely by the economic mandate to extract wealth, immediately brought out objects made of gold and silver to show to the indigenous leaders.
Trying to ascertain if the precious metals existed inland.
Right. And Caminha noted with deep confusion that the Tupiniquim examined the gold and silver but displayed absolutely no recognition of their monetary value nor any desire to possess the objects. They were completely indifferent to the bullion.
It is a sharp, profound contrast. You have this obsessive, globalized European machine aggressively pursuing gold, making contact with a society operating on a completely different system of human value and resources.
It really is.
Now, there is an ongoing historical debate about Cabral's arrival in Brazil. Was this truly a serendipitous accident, a ship blown off course by a storm, or did they know it was there?
The navigational data heavily suggests it was not entirely accidental. To successfully execute the Volta do Mar in the South Atlantic, to catch the fast-moving westerly winds that would sling the fleet eastward around the Cape of Good Hope, a pilot had to intentionally push the fleet extremely far westward into the deep ocean.
Right. That maneuver was called the Volta do Largo, the wide turn. How wide is wide?
Cabral sailed a full 12 degrees of longitude further west than was strictly necessary to avoid the doldrums off the African coasts.
12 degrees.
He pushed so deep into the western Atlantic that the massive eastern bulge of the South American continent was sitting right in his flight path. By aggressively optimizing the route to India using the atmospheric physics they had mastered, the encounter with Brazil was virtually inevitable.
Whether the Portuguese crown had secret knowledge of the landmass prior to 1500 remains debated, but the physics of their navigation guaranteed they would hit it eventually. Discovering these immense new territories was a staggering achievement. But from a geopolitical standpoint, planting a flag is meaningless if you cannot defend the claim.
Right.
Securing legal dominance over the globe without triggering a catastrophic continent-wide war in Europe was the next monumental challenge. And this brings Portugal into direct, intense diplomatic conflict with their neighbor, Spain.
The crisis begins in 1493. Christopher Columbus, an Italian navigator sailing under the sponsorship of the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, returns from his first voyage across the Atlantic. He believes he's found a western route to Asia.
Right.
Crucially, on his return journey, a severe storm damages his ship and forces him to seek emergency shelter in the port of Lisbon.
So Columbus has to go sit in front of King John II of Portugal and show him the maps of what he just claimed for Spain.
And King John II looks at the charts and calmly informs Columbus that, according to existing international law, everything he just discovered legally belongs to Portugal.
How does he justify that?
Okay.
Columbus sailed west, Portugal had been sailing south.
Well, decades earlier, to protect their monopoly on the African coast, Portugal had secured a papal bull from Rome, the Attorney Regis, in 1481. This papal decree granted Portugal exclusive rights to all non-Christian lands discovered south of the latitude of the Canary Islands.
And Columbus's discoveries fell south of that line.
Since Columbus's discoveries in the Caribbean fell south of that specific latitude, King John argued they were Portuguese territory.
Spain is obviously not going to accept that.
Spain immediately launched a diplomatic counteroffensive. They appealed directly to the sitting Pope, Alexander VI, and in a massive stroke of geopolitical luck for Spain, Pope Alexander VI was born Rodrigo Borgia.
Let me guess. He was Spanish.
He was Spanish, a clear conflict of interest.
Completely.
The Pope issued a series of new bulls in 1493 that essentially rewrote the map. He drew a vertical line of demarcation from the North Pole to the South Pole, located 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. The Pope decreed that everything west of that line belonged exclusively to Spain, and everything east belonged to Portugal.
This papal ruling effectively cuts Portugal off from the entire newly discovered Western Hemisphere. How does King John II react? I mean, he doesn't go to war.
He executes a masterstroke of diplomacy. He realizes that appealing to a Spanish pope is useless. So he bypasses the Vatican entirely and opens direct bilateral negotiations with Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. The Portuguese diplomats leverage Spain's fear of a naval war, and they force a compromise that results in the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494.
Famous line on the map. What did the treaty actually change?
The Portuguese successfully demanded that the Pope's line be pushed significantly further west. The Treaty of Tordesillas moved the demarcation line to 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands.
By pushing that line a few hundred miles to the left, King John accomplishes two massive strategic goals, right?
Exactly. First, he created a massive, legally secure buffer zone in the Atlantic to protect the Volta do Largo maneuver. Portuguese armadas could swing deep into the Western Ocean on their way to India without technically entering Spanish waters.
Ah, very smart. And the second goal?
Second, and this goes back to the debate over Cabral's intent, that new line sliced right through the eastern edge of the South American continent. It legally captured the entire bulge of Brazil, placing it firmly within the Portuguese hemisphere 6 years before Cabral officially discovered it.
Let's talk about the absolute absurdity of enforcing this treaty, though. It is one thing for two monarchs and a pope to draw a line on a piece of parchment in a palace in Europe. But out on the open ocean, how did a ship captain actually know whose side of the hemisphere he was floating on?
In a practical sense, they didn't. They couldn't.
Wait, we just spent an enormous amount of time detailing how they perfected astronavigation.
They perfected the calculation of latitude distance north or south. But the Treaty of Tordesillas established a line of longitude distance east or west.
What's the problem with measuring longitude?
To calculate longitude at sea, you need to know the exact time at your home port compared to the exact local solar time on your ship. That requires a chronometer, a clock made of gears and springs that can keep perfect time on a rocking, humid, temperature-fluctuating ship for months.
And that technology does not exist yet.
It wouldn't be invented until the 18th century. So during this period, positioning the Tordesillas line was essentially high-stakes guesswork. It relied on dead reckoning, estimates of distance, and incredibly heated diplomatic arguing.
The records highlight a specific event where this scientific limitation caused a total diplomatic meltdown to the Badajoz Conference of 1524.
The conference was convened to finally settle the exact location of the Tordesillas line. Spain and Portugal both sent their top experts, the most brilliant cartographers, astronomers, and veteran pilots of the age, to a room in Badajoz to hash it out.
And what happens when you put the greatest scientific minds of the 16th century in a room to draw a line?
Complete chaos. They spent the entire conference arguing over the fundamental metrics of the planet. They couldn't agree on the exact circumference of the Earth.
Seriously.
They argued fiercely over the exact mathematical length of a marine league. They even fought over which specific island in the Cape Verde archipelago the measurement should start from, because choosing the westernmost island versus the easternmost island shifted the line by dozens of miles.
So the science was totally subordinate to the politics.
Completely. Both sides intentionally manipulated the astronomical data and warped the maps to favor their respective territorial claims. The conference ended in a total failure to reach an agreement.
This inability to draw the line becomes a massive global crisis when we flip the globe around. Because if you draw a line down the middle of the Atlantic, it eventually wraps all the way around the Earth and creates an anti-meridian on the other side, in the Pacific.
And sitting right on that disputed anti-meridian were the Moluccas.
The Spice Islands.
Located in present-day Indonesia, the Moluccas were the epicenter of global wealth. At that specific moment in history, they were the absolute only place on the planet where cloves grew.
And cloves were valuable.
Cloves were so highly prized in Europe for their medicinal properties and culinary prestige that they were literally traded pound for gold.
So naturally, both empires look at their distorted maps and claim the islands fall into their half of the world.
Spain claimed the anti-meridian fell west of the Moluccas, making them Spanish. Portugal claimed the line fell east, making them Portuguese. They were on the brink of an incredibly expensive war over a few tiny volcanic islands.
How is it resolved? If science can't fix it, money usually does.
In 1529, they signed the Treaty of Zaragoza. Essentially, the Portuguese king realized that fighting a war with Spain halfway across the globe would eat up all his profits. So he simply bought the Spanish claim. Portugal paid the Spanish crown 350,000 ducats of solid gold to firmly establish the Pacific anti-meridian east of the Moluccas, permanently securing the clove monopoly for Lisbon.
Okay, with the world legally partitioned between Spain and Portugal, the sea routes mapped, and the monopoly secured, the era of exploration officially closes.
The mission shifts.
Portugal is now faced with the task of managing and defending a vast, highly lucrative, and ultimately precarious maritime machine. How does a tiny country with a tiny population exert control over half the globe?
They recognized their limits. They abandoned the Roman model of empire. The Portuguese did not attempt to conquer massive inland territories in Asia. They knew they would be immediately swallowed up by the massive armies of the Indian and Asian empires.
So what's the play?
Instead, they relied entirely on their overwhelming technological advantage, naval artillery. They utilized the Vittoria system on a massive, violent scale.
They conquered the choke points.
Exactly. Under leaders like Afonso de Albuquerque, they aggressively captured the strategic nodes of the Indian Ocean network. In 1510, they besieged and captured Goa on the west coast of India, creating a central command base.
Securing a foothold.
In 1511, they violently conquered Malacca, seizing control of the vital straits that connected the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea.
Another toll booth.
In 1515, they captured Ormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, allowing them to choke off the old overland caravan routes to Venice. And eventually, they negotiated a settlement at Macau to establish a permanent gateway into the massive markets of Ming Dynasty China.
So they control the physical doors to the trade routes. But how do they control the ships actually moving the goods? The Indian Ocean was packed with Gujarati, Arab, and Chinese merchant vessels. The Portuguese couldn't sink every ship.
They implemented an incredibly aggressive, highly organized protection racket called the Cartes system.
Break down the mechanics of a protection racket on the high seas.
The Portuguese crown declared a total unilateral royal monopoly on the trade of spices in the Indian Ocean. They mandated that any non-Portuguese shipping vessel operating anywhere in the region had to purchase a licensing document called a cartaz.
You had to buy a permit to sail in your own waters.
Yes. Furthermore, possessing the cartaz required the merchant ship to drop anchor at a Portuguese-controlled port like Goa or Malacca and pay hefty customs duties on their entire cargo.
And if an Arab dhow decides they don't recognize the authority of the King of Portugal and tries to slip past?
The Portuguese armadas constantly patrolled the shipping lanes. If they intercepted a vessel that did not possess a valid cartaz, the consequences were absolute.
What would they do?
The Portuguese would board the ship, confiscate the entire cargo, strip the vessel of valuables, and then use their heavy naval cannons to sink the ship, often with the crew still aboard.
So it's pure extortion enforced by the barrel of a cannon.
Yes. Their ships were built to absorb the massive recoil of heavy artillery, whereas the traditional sewn-plank dhows of the Indian Ocean were not built for naval broadsides. The technological disparity allowed the extortion to work.
It was highly effective for a time, generating immense wealth. But the records indicate that the geographic center of gravity for this empire eventually shifted away from Asia.
Yeah, that happened later on.
Why the shift?
Maintaining the Asian monopoly was incredibly expensive. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the Portuguese were facing intense, aggressive competition from newly formed, highly capitalized corporate entities, the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company.
The mega corporations arrive.
Exactly. These nations had superior financial structures and larger fleets, and they slowly began dismantling the Portuguese nodes in Asia.
But just as the Asian spice profits begin to wane, Portugal hits a second, even larger jackpot across the Atlantic.
In the late 17th century, massive deposits of gold and subsequently diamonds were discovered in the interior of Brazil. This unleashed a massive gold rush.
A pivot to the west.
The absolute core of the Portuguese economic empire heavily pivoted away from the Indian Ocean and locked onto the extraction of mineral wealth and sugar from the Americas.
I want to pull back and synthesize the sheer scale of what this tiny nation built. At the absolute peak of the India trade, a single returning Portuguese armada could carry 35,000 quintals of pepper.
It's an astronomical amount.
We are talking about thousands of tons of spices, worth unimaginable sums of money, moving across thousands of miles of hostile ocean in a single coordinated fleet. It is an administrative and engineering marvel. But when you weigh that immense glittering wealth against a long-term reality back in Lisbon, did this globe-spanning maritime empire ultimately cripple Portugal's internal development?
The historical consensus strongly points to the ultimate fragility of this imperial model. It is a story of spectacular, rapid growth masking deep, systemic rot.
How so?
The massive influx of wealth from spices and later Brazilian gold heavily enriched the monarchy. It funded the construction of monumental, opulent architecture like the Jerónimos Monastery in Lisbon. It sustained a lavish, powerful aristocracy.
But it did not build a nation.
No, it did not filter down to build a sustainable domestic economy. Because the crown held a tight monopoly on the most lucrative trades, it actively stifled the rise of an independent, entrepreneurial, middle-class bourgeoisie.
The wealth stayed at the top.
The brightest minds and strongest backs were siphoned off to man the ships or administrate the colonies. As we discussed, domestic agriculture collapsed. And crucially, because Portugal could simply buy whatever manufactured goods it needed from Northern Europe using its gold, it severely delayed its own industrialization compared to nations like England or the Netherlands.
It was an economy addicted to extraction rather than production.
Exactly. Furthermore, we must continually acknowledge that this entire economic edifice was built upon the aggressive extraction of finite resources and the widespread, systemic, and horrific implementation of enslaved human labor.
Right.
The immense, incalculable human suffering it generated in Africa, the Americas, and Asia ran in parallel to its economic growth. It was an empire built on the fluid dynamics of the ocean, and like the ocean, its wealth flowed in as a massive tidal wave, but as it receded, it eroded the very foundations of the nation itself.
The actions, the technologies, and the sheer audacity of those voyages completely rewired the global economy. They forced disparate cultures into violent, transformative contact and shaped the modern world in ways we are still untangling today. But before we finish this analysis, there is a fascinating, almost philosophical reflection drawn from the records regarding the physical, bodily act of exploration. It wasn't just the maps that changed.
When Portuguese navigators finally pushed their ships far south of the equator, crossing into the southern hemisphere, they literally ran out of familiar stars.
The sky itself was different.
For millennia, European sailors and astronomers had oriented their lives, their religions, and their science around the northern constellations, primarily Polaris, the North Star.
But as you sail south along the curvature of the Earth, the North Star sinks lower and lower until it drops completely below the horizon behind you.
For the first time in documented European history, human beings were forced to stand on the deck of a ship, look up at the night sky, and stare into a completely new, undocumented canopy of stars.
They had to completely reinvent their celestial map. They had to rely on entirely new formations like the constellation of the Southern Cross to orient their instruments and find their way home.
Documenting this new sky was absolutely mathematically necessary for their survival, but the record suggests it had a profound, cascading psychological impact back in Europe.
It changed how they saw the universe.
It forced humanity to fundamentally abandon the medieval Ptolemaic idea of a closed, finite, safe universe centered entirely around familiar European geography.
It broke the dome.
It shattered it. By forcing their awareness to expand to include massive new continents, previously unimaginable oceans, and an entirely new alien canopy of stars above their heads, it fundamentally shifted human consciousness. It was the brutal, violent, and brilliant birth of the reality of an infinite, ever-expanding, interconnected global space.
The world was suddenly exponentially larger, and the very sky they steered by had permanently changed. It is an incredibly powerful image to leave on. You build the technology to sail far enough into the unknown, and eventually, even the immutable stars you steer by have to be completely reimagined. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.